Okay, and you're live.
Good morning and welcome to Gulf Specimen Marine Lab. And this is our 5th live stream, and we're very happy to have you here. Please, as we talk about our organism today, which is the horseshoe crab, feel free to write in questions and we'll take time at the end to answer any of those. But I want to talk about these guys because they are very, very ancient. Those of you who've been watching the promos on our Facebook page know that these are often referred to as living fossils. They they've been around in the world's oceans since way before fish. And so they've seen a lot. They hit upon a body pattern and a lifestyle that has just suited them for all of those many millennia. They're in many ways very primitive arthropod. Now, arthropods there are lots and lots of different kinds. It's the world's biggest group of living organisms except for bacteria, and so they're just everywhere. You usually probably think of insects. They're also an arthropod. Arthropod means jointed leg, essentially. You know, like arthritis refers to your joints. And all of them have these tubular jointed appendages. Here you can see a bunch of them. I'm going to try and get him to open up a little better. There we go. And you can see his legs, and I'm referring to this one as a his, and it is a he, and I'll tell you in a little bit why. But I want to talk about the fact that besides these jointed legs, and they all have a exoskeleton that is made out of the same stuff, most of the arthropods that live in the ocean are crustaceans. The horseshoe crab is a exception to that. It's a much more primitive arthropod, and has been around for a longer period of time. But one of the things that's true of all arthropods is that once this hard outer shell has tanned, it's not going to grow anymore. So in order for them to grow bigger, they have to shed this shell or molt. And all arthropods do that. You don't find a bunch of insect molts around usually because they eat theirs. But in the ocean, oftentimes the crustacean molts and certainly horseshoe crab molts are something that we find all the time on the beach. And I want to show you this one. This is not a dead horseshoe crab. Oftentimes when you go to the beach, you may find what you think is a dead horseshoe crab, but when you pick it up, it's really, really light. And what has happened is that the animal has shed that shell. As they're beginning to add tissue and the cells are getting bigger on the inside, it triggers a hormonal response for them to build a whole new shell underneath this old one. And when that new shell is complete, the old shell will split along some seam. And in horseshoe crabs, that seam is right here at the front. I'm going to try and get it, yeah, there, you can see that it's open a little bit. Okay, and essentially they then, once that shell is complete and this opens up, then they crawl out and they pull all of the new shell out of all the old shell, and it usually takes several hours. Many horseshoe crabs and many crustaceans usually do that when they're buried, but you can see the features of the external anatomy are still very obvious. You can still see the covers, lens covers over the eyes. You can see all of the legs are demonstrated. One of the things that I find most interesting is in this molt you can see the gills really clearly, because in a live horseshoe crab it just looks like a flat page, and once they have molted, they've pulled every single little gill flap out of these covers, You can even see in the molt, they molt a part of their stomach. I'm going to pull this molt open a little bit. And right here you see part of the stomach that has actually been molted along with everything else. Now, oftentimes when you find these, then the crab is still out there somewhere, bigger and better than ever, okay? And so let's talk about this little guy. He's in his very own group of arthropods. And a lot of people have probably heard that he's most closely related to spiders and scorpions. And he doesn't look much like a spider or a scorpion. And so that's kind of, you know, you're going, how is he related? Well, I'm going to show you here in just a minute. But first of all, spiders and scorpions have two body parts. And he also has two major body regions. Okay. The other thing is, right here at the top of his mouth, he has these tiny little legs that I often call the knife and fork legs, because this is usually what he is not cooperating. He usually cuts up his food with, and right underneath those little legs are his mouth, and he has a lot of little bristly stuff on those appendage bases right there that he uses to kind of squish up his food. But in spiders, the same little pair of legs is present, except it only, instead of having a whole claw at the end, it's only got one, what they call finger, and that's what makes the spider's fangs. And in scorpions, those great big, look like lobster claw features are the same little set of claws that are right directly above the mouth. And that's what puts him in that same group. The fact that he's got two body parts and those little tiny, that little tiny set of legs at the front. Now, his legs are also, most of them are clawed at the end, okay? And I always tell kids, these guys have the world's wimpiest claws, because like I can put my finger, this one's tiny, so he probably wouldn't hurt me anyway, but even on a big one, you can put your finger right in that claw and nothing really happens very much. It's not a very strong claw. It's just used for picking up bits and pieces of stuff off the floor. They're kind of scavengers. They'll eat almost anything they run up into. Pieces of algae, peaches, you know, little pieces of shrimp or other dead animals that might be have fallen to the ocean floor. That's their major food source. Okay, now at the very last leg, it has this little flower-like structure. I'm going to see if I can hang on to it there. But that leg is used for digging, okay? And it pushes the sand away so that he can bury down into the sand. And I'm going to show you how I know this is a male, okay? On this, not that little pair of knife and fork legs, but the next pair of legs has this little round muscle. Come on, show that off for me. Maybe if I stick him underwater for a minute, he'll let me get underneath it better. But this little round muscle and the hook on the end allow him, he slides that over the back of a female horseshoe crab, and then she will carry him around. And that's probably good for him to save energy. The males are usually smaller than the females, but also when she lays her eggs, he will be right there to fertilize them. And in fact, some apparently really attractive females may have 2 or 3 little male horseshoe crabs attached behind her, and they'll all be, they'll slip that little hook over one of these parts in the back, so that when she comes ashore to lay her eggs, that they'll be right there to go ahead and fertilize them. Now, they do come up on the shore in order to lay their eggs, and in some states during the breeding season, people see hundreds and thousands of them up on the beach. They dig a little hole and they deposit the eggs in that hole, and then they drag the males right over the eggs and they deposit the sperm on top of them, and then the little eggs develop in the sand because she's come ashore when the tide is really, really high, and she's gone up above the high tide line and she's dug her little nest in there and laid the eggs in that area, and that way they'll be a little more protected from predators. And the eggs are huge compared to a lot of things that live in the ocean. They're nearly 1/8 of an inch across. And for those of you who haven't done so, we put up a video yesterday on our Facebook page that had a little horseshoe crab larvae inside the egg, and you can see it tumbling around in there and moving, and it looks pretty much like the adult horseshoe crabs, except it does not have a big long tail. The tail forms later over several molts. And one of the things that people always ask me is, how often do they molt? And that depends on a number of things. When they're very young, they may molt every couple days, okay? I'm going to show you in this little sandy patch here, I have a tiny little horseshoe crab. Where did he go? Here he is. He's just itty bitty. Okay, but when he first hatched out of that little egg, he probably molted every couple of days until he got to be about 1/2 inch long or so. And then the time between molts will lengthen, and by the time they're an older female, and they can be 2 feet long, the body part, and that those are probably molting every couple of years. They're not molting very often at all, and you'll see some old big females, sometimes they'll have lots and lots of things growing on them because they just haven't shed that shell in a very, very long time. But we're very lucky in our area that we can find both the large adults and these young juvenile crabs on a low tide. If you go out to the flats, oftentimes you'll see what looks like a little it looks like a little hump in the sand with a trail behind it, and you can just reach right down and dig up that little horseshoe crab. He won't be out and about, but he will be right underneath the surface of the sand looking for any food he can come in contact with. Now, another thing that is very distinctive about horseshoe crabs is this big long tail. And a lot of people are very frightened of horseshoe crabs because they feel like they look a lot like a stingray, and they do. Oftentimes they have kind of this basically round body, and they have this big long pointy tail. And it looks like it could really do some damage, and when I ask kids what they think it's for, they always think it's, to stab something with, or to poke you with if you're trying to mess with it, etc. But actually, the function of this big long tail is to help it turn over, so that it's a lever, essentially, that it can push down into the sand. I'm going to turn this little guy over, and the first thing he's going to do is just push that down. So if it were in sand, see, there he did it. He just pushed off of stuff, and that's going to help him turn back over. Need some help? There we go. Okay, so that's basically the function of that tail. It's not to do any damage. Now, another thing that is kind of unique about the horseshoe crabs is they have one of the very first compound eyes to ever develop. And those of you who who've ever looked closely at a housefly or a honeybee or any of those insects, they have compound eyes. And by that we mean there are several eyes that each have a lens and a nerve and a retina to catch light, etc. And they're all kind of bundled together. And the lens is part of the outer shell and will be shed essentially when they molt. You can see and count all the little lenses on them. But the compound eye is very important in the horseshoe crab. It does detect an image. Now, how good that image is, I don't know. I have a feeling I look pretty blurry to this horseshoe crab, and he's probably wondering, what is that thing they're filming with? But they do detect an image with that. Now, they have several other eyes. If you look right down here, you see two little spots that look kind of like a nose, but he doesn't have a nose because he breathes with gills, okay? And those are actually eye spots. They're little cups that are filled with light reactive pigment, and those little eyes help him detect, basically it detects light and dark. And so oftentimes if I put my hand over those eyes, he may start to do things. Yeah, I can feel him starting. He's starting to move those legs because he wants to bury, because he's afraid there's a big predator over the top of him. And so he's trying to take, you know, action and get to where he can't be seen. And he has several other pairs of legs. I understand there are like 10, or I've even heard 12 pairs of eyes that are kind of scattered over the underside and the back part of the body, but they're not really visible to the naked eye, and so I can't show you those. And in truth, I really don't even know what all of them are for. But he has this big, strong muscle right in here that helps him fold the two parts of his body. And when they're young, in fact, I'm going to turn over that little bitty horseshoe crab again, and we'll see if he'll swim for us. It's when they're young. Nope, that's not the littlest one. What do we do with that little crab?
Here we go.
There we go. Okay, I'm going to turn him over, and oftentimes you'll see that by folding and unfolding the body, essentially they will swim. And they can do that even as an adult. And I've seen some fairly large horseshoe crabs swimming that way. He's not going to do it for us. He's like, no, I'm not swimming. So we'll turn him back over. But sometimes they will, you can see them swimming. We see them every once in a while in the tanks when we come in. They'll be swimming. And that's a very unique kind of locomotion in these animals. Now, I wanted to kind of show you the gills, and I don't know, it's really hard to show you the gills. They have what are called book gills, and that's because they have these big, like, page structures. They hate it when you mess with their gills. You could kind of, if I can lift it up here, what you don't see is that there are lots and lots of little folded pieces of tissue, and that's what I showed you earlier in the molt. You can see it in here because it kind of gets swollen with water, and each cover has been, it's got air in it, and so it looks a little bit different. But that gives them lots and lots of surface area on which to take oxygen out of the water and get rid of carbon dioxide. Okay. Now, while we have him upside down here, I want to show you right up here, we see these little kind of cream colored areas right around the joints usually of their legs, and it looks almost like pus. And I've had kids go, ooh, it's got a bobo. But what those are little worms, and this is that little worm. This one is crawling around for us. These are a type of flatworm. They don't really have a common name other than horseshoe crab flatworm, and they feed on any algae or bacteria or whatever might be growing on the surface of the exoskeleton. They're not parasitic. They're not feeding off the blood or fluids of the horseshoe crab at all. And they're just using the horseshoe crab as a safe home away from other predators, and where they have kind of a constant food source as stuff tries to settle on the surface of the horseshoe crab. Okay. You can see here where barnacles have settled on the outside of that horseshoe crab. Okay, I want to go over to the female. And you can see that the female, I'm going to move the male over here just for comparison, but the male is usually quite a bit smaller than the female. And like I said, I've seen females where you couldn't even fit them in this tray. They're so large. But the male would slip his little hooked appendage right around one of these little spines on the sides of her abdomen, and that way she would be able to cart him around. I'm going to turn her over now. She's not going to be happy. She's going to keep trying to turn back over, and she's kind of slimy on the other side because part of her's been out of the water. But one of the things I wanted to show you, all these claws with these, quote, little wimpy claws. See? I put my finger right in there. I'm not screaming. I'm not trying to throw the horseshoe crab around because they're just not that strong. They're just for picking up stuff off the bottom of the ocean in order to feed. And one of the things I want to show you, see, here's her little knife and fork legs. This is her mouth right in here. And it looks very brushy and bristly. Okay, come on. I want to show off your mouth. I'm going to put my finger right where the mouth is. Okay? And they kind of squish things, and then inside that mouth, once it moves down into the esophagus, they have a real muscular structure around the esophagus that is referred to oftentimes as a gizzard. And it has hard parts that help it to crush and masticate or chew any of the food items that are too big for it to swallow otherwise. And then it's going to move that down on into the gut. Another thing that is found around the esophagus of the horseshoe crab is its brain. It's got an interesting, many marine invertebrates have what's called a circumesophageal set of ganglia. That is their brain. Okay, so it's just a big nerve that goes around the esophagus, and it's got little round concentrations of nerve cells that send off nerves out into the other parts of the body. And it has a nerve cord that, unlike our nerve cord that travels down the back of our bodies, their nerve cord travels down the stomach side of their body. Okay, and that's true of many other invertebrates as well as this one. Okay, I'm going to get her nice and wet, get her eyes all wet. Okay, do we have any questions so far?
Oh, yeah. Can you talk a little bit about your special blue blood?
Yes, I can. I had totally forgotten about that for a minute, but horseshoe crabs are actually harvested, and some of their blood is extracted, and the blood is kind of a teal blue color, because they have a copper-based blood pigment that hangs on to the oxygen. We have a iron-based pigment, hemoglobin, that hangs on to oxygen in our blood, but their blood pigment is this copper-based color, and so it has that kind of teal blue color. But one of the wonderful things about their blood is that they have a compound in their blood that's called Limulus lysate, and I think there are a couple of other names that I've read, but essentially this is a material that reacts with gram-negative bacteria. And gram-negative bacteria are really, really hard to detect, and they're really hard to get rid of if you get an infection of gram-negative bacteria. And so they have used this compound to make they purify it and use just the lysate. And if you put it in something that has gram-negative bacteria, it will clump all up. And kind of like those of you who might seen blood tests done where the blood clumps up, it does the exact same thing with this compound. It forms little clumps, and that lets them know that there are bacteria there. So any injectable medication that you have been taking, any IV solutions, all of those are usually tested with this compound from horseshoe crabs. And it's a very important part of medical science anymore. And you know, in the middle of this pandemic, we're all realizing how important it is that we have knowledge about a lot of different things and how they work. And that's one of the things that horseshoe crabs have become really, really important for. They also, they use them a lot for bait along the East Coast. There's a big eel industry in some parts of the East Coast, and horseshoe crabs are our very favorite food for eel bait. Their numbers have been dropping recently. We don't know exactly why, but it's suspected maybe we're over harvesting them for bait, or some of the ones that we use for blood collection, maybe they're not surviving. There's a lot to be investigated yet, but one of the things that is problematic about their declining numbers is the fact that those eggs that we showed you earlier are a really, really important food source. Particularly for migratory birds. Many of the birds that migrate up from South America into the United States feed on the coastal areas, and their migration coincides with the peak of egg laying in the horseshoe crabs. And I know in the past they've actually calculated the tons of horseshoe crab eggs that are necessary to sustain a successful migration of small birds, shorebirds in particular, little sandpipers and plovers and all of those things that really, really depend on this as an important nutrient-rich food source after they've flown across the ocean or before they go to fly back across the ocean.
Okay. There's a question from Carl La Follette, and he says, thanks for the great video. And are horseshoe crabs different on the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico? And do they migrate?
It is the same species in the Atlantic and the Gulf, and Limulus polyphemus, and there appears to be slightly different times in the time that they breed, and probably due to climate. There's slightly different climates along the Gulf than on the east coast of the U.S. But there are 4 species of horseshoe crabs still in existence today. This is the only one that's found in the U.S. waters, coastal waters.
Where else are they found at?
That is a good question. There's some found in the Pacific Ocean, particularly around, I want to say Indonesia.
Malaysia.
Don't put money on that. Malaysia we know for sure, but otherwise they're all in the Pacific.
Okay. And John Gammon, he asked, what is the outer shell made out of?
It's made out of a material that's called chitin, which is a protein. And chitin is found in a number of things. It's found in the cell walls of fungi and mushrooms. And it's found in all insect exoskeleton, crustacean exoskeletons. And then in with the protein, they can place calcium carbonate or other things that might make them harder. Those that live in the ocean usually have a pretty rich amount of calcium carbonate limestone in the exoskeleton. Insects don't have as much, and calcium carbonate is really abundant in ocean waters. Insects that use calcium carbonate, oftentimes the reason they consume their shed shell is because they're trying to regain some of that calcium carbonate. Horseshoe crabs and many crustaceans take some calcium and put it in their bloodstream as they're molting, and then once the molt is complete, then the calcium will come out of solution in the bloodstream and be deposited in the shell itself. Spiders, for instance, they don't have a really hard shell, virtually no calcium, but the chitin is an important feature of that skeleton.
Okay. Alice Busha-Corey asks, how long can they live in the wild?
Ooh. I believe there are records of horseshoe crabs living over 30 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Do they have any natural predators?
Yeah, probably. I know loggerhead sea turtles will eat them. Some, when they're small like these, probably a number of fish will eat them, like drum, I'm sure, if they can find them, would go ahead and eat them. Some sharks have been found with them in their stomach contents, but when they get really big, there's probably not a whole lot that feeds on them.
Okay. Robert E. Doe asks, I saw the video posted of the horseshoe crab egg yesterday. How old was that?
You know, I don't think we know. We found them in a tank that we have, and we don't really know when those eggs were laid. So, but probably within the last 3 weeks, wouldn't you say, Allison?
Yeah.
Because, yeah, I would say within the last 3 weeks or so.
Yeah. He also asks, do they actually hatch out, and how?
They do hatch out, and okay, I'm speculating wildly here. I have no data, but most things have an enzyme that when they are ready to hatch, they secrete, and the enzyme eats through the shell of the egg. And I'm guessing that in horseshoe crabs, the same is true, that they probably release an enzyme, and that makes little thin spots in the membrane of the egg, which would allow them to hatch on out.
Do people cultivate horseshoe crabs? Do they farm them?
Not that I know of.
Why
and
not?
In fact, they're not a big food source for humans in most places. I mean, there are people who eat them, and I have read that big mussel is eaten in places. I know when I was working on the coast of Mississippi, we had a number of fishermen who were from Vietnam, and they would take the legs and saute them up just like you might king crabs or whatever, and eat the eggs. But there's not a whole lot of tissue in this animal that would be available for eating. In a lot of what's there is going to be covered in chitin, which is pretty difficult to eat. I mean, you know, we take the shells off our shrimp and our lobster and all that kind of stuff. The chitin is not really easy to eat unless they're soft shell. They're not a big food source. Jack Redlow was talking this morning about people who opened them up and took the eggs before they were laid and ate the eggs. So apparently, you know, in many parts of this animal's range, it has been used as a food source, but not something that's probably really sought after.
Okay. And Taylor asks, why didn't we see that many at Boalt Point this February?
You know, I think February is probably a little early for them to be coming up to lay their eggs. And I know I've seen big aggregations of them in late May and early June. And you see occasional ones coming up ashore earlier than that, but February seems pretty early for me too. I'm sure it's happened in some years depending on water temperature and that kind of thing.
So do they mate in the summer?
Yeah, usually throughout most of their range they mate in, the peak of mating is in late spring, early summer.
And do they only come up to shore to mate?
Yes. I mean, they don't come out of the water otherwise because they're very sensitive. I mean, they dry out. They just, you know, they come ashore usually on the highest tide, lay those eggs, and go right back into the ocean. Occasionally, some of them get stranded, but yeah, the coming ashore is strictly probably to keep the eggs away from as many predators as possible. Birds were probably, you know, they were there long before birds, so they didn't have a strategy for dealing with all those birds that eat the eggs.
Well, I heard they mate during the full moon. Is that true?
Well, that's oftentimes when the highest tides are. Okay, in the full moon is when we get what we call spring tides, where we have really, really high highs and low lows. And oftentimes that's right around the full moon.
Okay. Robert Doe asks another question. What is your range throughout the world?
I don't know. I know that in the U.S. they range all the way up into Maine, although they're not terribly common in Maine, but all the way down the East Coast, Maryland, Delaware. They're fairly, that's where probably the largest concentrations are, what I would call the mid-Atlantic states, and then all the way down in through Florida and around into the Gulf, all the way through the Gulf down into Mexico.
Do they live in shallow waters, and are they found in deeper waters?
I want to say primarily shallow waters, and by shallow I mean probably to 100 feet or so, and maybe even deeper than that, but mostly shallow.
Is there a reason why they have blue blood? Like, what is it for?
Well, I think that we have a number of organisms that have blood pigments that are not the same as our own blood pigment, that beautiful bright red. Although there are some marine organisms that have hemoglobin just like we do, there are also a number of them that use these copper-based pigments, which, as I understand it, are not quite as good at grabbing onto the oxygen, but are still pretty good at grabbing onto the oxygen and holding it in solution.
Do octopuses have the same blood?
I don't think so, but I don't know.
Okay, Janet Moore Belcher asks, how long does it take for their eggs to hatch?
I want to say 4 to 8 weeks, and I'm kind of basing that on the fact that you would want them to hatch about the next high tide, the highest tide. So if they lay the eggs on a really high tide at the high, you know, at the full moon, and about 4 weeks later there's going to be another full moon, and a very high tide, that many of them may hatch then, but sometimes it might take 8 weeks. And I'm guessing that that would probably depend on temperature.
Okay, and I think that is it that we have for questions today.
Okay, thank you so much for watching, and I just want to preview a couple of the live streams that we'll be doing in the future. We're going to take a look at snails next week and talk all about those wonderful little snails, and then seahorses the week after that. So stay with us, and hopefully we'll have some things that are new and that you learn that are fun.
All right, thank you guys for joining us.